Grab your cuppa. It's time for the Inclusivi-T podcast, spilling the tea on disability inclusivity. Hi, my name is Jamie Shields, and you are listening to the Inclusivi-T. The reason I'm emphasising the T is because when you look at the spelling, we drop the Y and we end in IV-T. And this is a podcast where we are spilling the tea on inclusivity, specifically disability inclusivity, and how you as an organisation or you as an individual working within an organisation can take the tips, the info, the advice, and just the absolute knowledge coming from our guest speakers over the next couple of episodes. Now, please do check out our socials. It is at the Inclusivity. I will get that popping up on the screen for you too if you're watching on YouTube. And for full accessibility, we do have a transcript online on our website. You can watch with captions below. They are not croptions, which is, so when they're automated, that does not work with an Irish accent. So they are manually captioned. And as well as that there, you can catch us across all your streaming platforms. If you want to get in touch, it's just jamie.shields at the Inclusivity. Deep breaths. First episode, we are going to be joined by an absolute legend. So today, spilling the tea on the inclusivity. If you can't see the camera, I just chased you with my lovely logo branded mug. If I had a marketing manager, they'd be very happy. That's me. So over to our guest. This is a guest who is a founder, is a CEO, and an absolute extraordinaire and an idol of mine. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Jamie. What an introduction.
Had to take a deep breath there, make sure I got every word. Now, Jane, you are the founder and CEO of Evenbreak. I just want to let our audience know, maybe if they've never heard of Evenbreak before, if you haven't, shame on you, go check out previous podcasts, check out their website. But Jane, tell us, what is Evenbreak? Who is Evenbreak?
Yeah, so I founded Evenbreak 11 years ago. So we've survived pandemics and goodness knows what, which is great. And we do three things, really. We help organisations and employers become more inclusive and accessible and remove any disabling barriers they might have. And we help disabled people who are looking for new or better work through a career hive and career support. And then we bring those two groups of people together on a specialist job board so that disabled candidates can find and identify those employers who are serious about disability inclusion, making them feel more confident to apply and to be open about their access needs. And we're a social enterprise, so we're a not-for-profit, and we only employ disabled people ourselves. So everybody at Evenbreak has lived experience of the barriers that our candidates face.
That's incredible. I think for me, representation matters. We all know this. And to see that, I think the term is it positive discrimination? Is that the term you use when you are supporting a group who typically are underrepresented in the workplace? I'm hoping I've got that right. Is that right?
Positive action, really. So it's not, yeah, it's positive action. So we're not, I mean, at Evenbreak, we discriminate against non-disabled people. And I've had people say to me, well, I couldn't work for you then because I'm not disabled. And my answer is, yep, we are discriminating against you. And once we run out of talented disabled people, we might start looking for non-disabled people. But yeah, I mean, in industry generally, if you look, you can positively attract, disabled candidates. Because we're much less likely to get jobs, which is ridiculous because we are, as we know, premium candidates.
And we've had a conversation around this before, and that's probably where I've mixed action and discrimination up, because I remember you telling me before, people asking you that same scenario. And for me, I think that when you think of an organisation that is doing the work that you do, who is speaking to employers about how do we be inclusive for disabled people, why wouldn't you have those people who you're talking about as part of the conversation? It's the same when you think about media representation or representation in C-suite level. You really need that representation. And I think for yourself, Jane, you're an incredible advocate and representation for not just disabled people in the workplace, but for women in business as well. Because what you've done with Evenbreak is you've created not just a solution, but a resource for individuals and businesses. So can I ask you, as a person with disability, as an entrepreneur, what would you say where did you get the sense of belonging and the idea to create this?
Yeah, well, so I was in the field of inclusion and diversity for many, many years. I'm incredibly old. And Included in that was obviously disability, because disability is part of the whole inclusion conversation. But I wasn't disabled myself. But when I talked to employers about disability, particularly, they would be either saying, "Why would I want to employ a disabled person?" I mean, they might not use those exact words, but you kind of knew what they meant. Or more positively, they would be saying, "We recognize that this is a pool of talent we should be tapping into, but we don't know how." And I remember at the time thinking, somebody really ought to do something about that. And then I became one of the 83% of disabled people who become disabled as an adult. So at the age of 44, I developed this degenerative spinal condition, and nobody was doing anything about this whole issue. So I thought, well, maybe I should then. So I talked to disabled people who were saying, we don't know which employers are going to take us seriously, because they all say they're equal opportunities employers. But actually, we know that most aren't, particularly when it comes to disability. So, how do we know who to apply to? And so I'd kind of found my tribe, as it were, people who I didn't have to explain what it was like to be disabled to, because they knew, because they were living it too. And so the idea came up to have a job board that was just for disabled people, and just for those employers who were enlightened enough to see us as a source of talent rather than as a source of problems to solve. And I think, as you were just saying, that whole representation and lived experience is so important, because I'd been in the field of diversity and equal opportunities, as we called it back in the sort of 80s and 90s. And it was very much, white people talking to other white people about what black people needed, and men talking to men about what women needed, and non-disabled people talking to non-disabled people about what disabled people needed. And there's a slight problem with that model. And so I wasn't going to ever buy into that as a way of working. And so for me, it was around, I have lived experience of my own condition. So I know how chronic pain and some mobility issues affect me as an individual. But somebody else with exactly the same diagnosis might experience it differently, manage it differently, have different access needs. And that's without going to all of the other kind of conditions there might be. So neurodiversity, or sight loss, or hearing loss, or mental health conditions, or diabetes, or I mean, it goes on forever. And no one person can be an expert in all of that. It's too big, it's too wide. And so having disabled people working within Evenbreak meant that we covered a wider range of barriers that candidates might face. And so for me, I kind of found a place in a community that I was concerned about before and interested in, but certainly didn't belong to, and didn't feel really an affinity with, because I hadn't been through what they had been through. And so there is that kind of, and we talk about the disability community. I'm not sure there is such a thing, because we're all so diverse, aren't we? We're all different. It's completely intersectional. Disability doesn't discriminate. So you can be black or gay or female or old or young or rich or poor or whatever. You can still become disabled, and so it's not just around disability. It's also around all of those other characteristics. And actually, Evenbreak is really diverse in terms of those other things as well: culture and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation. So that, again, our candidates aren't just disabled people, they're disabled people who also have a gender and a race and a culture, and, all of those things as well.
And I think that's so important to have that intersectionality, because we're beautifully diverse. So we are, I don't come into work and say, right, I'm going to put on my blind hat today, and I'm going to take off my gay hat, or I'm going to put on my neurodivergent hat, or I'm going to put on Northern Ireland reference, I'm going to put on one of my Northern Irish reference hats. Because for me, I think that one of the things with disabilities, you said it doesn't discriminate, and most of us do acquire it later in life. Well, not most of us, because I was born with mine, but when you acquire it, your whole kind of life has to change. So can we talk maybe about that sense of belonging? In the workplace, how do you think people can really create that sense of belonging for somebody within an organization? How can they create that for them?
Yeah, and I think that's quite a big challenge when we come to disability, because it is so broad. And most disabled people have no outward sign of that disability. It's invisible. So they may be neurodiverse, they may have mental health conditions, they may be in pain, they may have diabetes. There could be so many conditions. 80 to 90% of disabled people don't look disabled. So how does the employer know who is and who isn't? And how do they make those people feel like they belong? Because actually, what happens is if you're working in an organization where you don't feel safe, any of those invisible differences that you might have, which could be to do with disability, could be to do with sexual orientation, um, you have that choice whether shall I mention this to my employer or shall I keep it secret? And actually, it's a bit of a no-win situation if the organization isn't great, because if you do mention it, you're worried that you're going to be discriminated against, thought about differently, treated differently, not be given promotion opportunities or career development opportunities. But on the other hand, if you don't mention it, it's exhausting to mask all the time and pretend that you are not gay or you don't have a mental health condition or you're neurotypical. And also, you can't ask for any adjustments that you might need because that would mean you'd have to be open. So, the challenge for the employer is to create an organizational culture where everybody, regardless of who they are, what characteristics they might have, feel safe to be who they are. So that actually, if we talk about difference, if we talk about culture, if we talk about mental health, if we talk about neurodiversity, it's in the same way that we might talk about what was on television last night or what the weather might be doing this weekend. That those conversations about difference become everyday mainstream conversations rather than them being the elephant in the room. And one of the really quick ways that I've seen of organizations building that kind of culture is for someone who is very senior within that organization to be open about their own hidden difference. So if somebody in a senior leadership position is quite open about their mental health condition or struggles, or maybe a relative they've got who struggles with invisible differences, it immediately makes it okay for everybody else in the organization to share their difference as well. Because if that senior person has got to that level within the organization, whilst being open about their whatever it might be, mental health condition, neurodiversity, whatever, then there's no reason why everybody else shouldn't. And so it just immediately gives everybody kind of permission to be who they are, knowing that it's not going to have a negative consequence for them. I mean, it's one of many ways, but it's a quick win if you do have a senior leader who does have some kind of difference.
And I think that for again, it goes back to that representation, doesn't it? Because I think in organizations specifically, like I know when I started AMS, I would have senior leaders and like it's director level, CEOs, even the founders reached out to me. And each time they've reached out to me, I've went, oh my God, I'm this little small fish, he's in this big pond. What do I do? But when I found out, that some of those people had lived experience in mental health, had lived experience of disability, it completely changed my mindset. And oh, this person's approaching me and I shouldn't speak to them. It was, this person's going to understand me. They're going to be able to understand the challenges I face because when we start employment, there's almost this I like to say it's like a transition period. Like when you're on a flight, it's a little bit turbulent. You'll have that little bit of turbulence as you wait for your adjustments because they don't always work. Like I didn't know what adjustments I needed, and I think trying to get that sense of belonging where you can discuss that, where you feel comfortable to do so, it takes a lot of work, I think, in the organization, but by having that representation, it does definitely make it a bit easier. But talking of belonging in an organization, one thing that I hear quite a lot at the moment is people talking around how do we get people to disclose disability? How do we get someone to tell us they're disabled? And for me, I kind of get a little bit angry at it because I'm like, well, why do you need to know? Surely the conversation should be, how do we support you, not how do we get you to tell us all your secret? So I want to ask you around your thoughts on that. What's your thoughts around how do we get people to disclose on that question?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely hit the nail on the head there, Jamie, because for me it's not about let's find out who's disabled in our organization so we can support them. I think for a successful organization, we should be thinking, how can we make this a place where every individual who works here is thriving, is being as productive as they can, is working in a way that works for them? So instead of, I wonder who's disabled and what we can give them, it should be a kind of, for every employee, every team member, a conversation around, we want you to thrive here. We want you to feel that you can be your very best self, that you can be productive, that you can contribute, that you feel safe, that you can have a voice that's going to be heard. What do we need to do for that to happen? And that might be someone saying, well, I need to pick my kids up at 3 o'clock. It might be nothing to do with disability. Or it might be somebody else saying, I'm not really a morning person. Please don't expect any sense from me before we get into double figures. Or it might be, well, I'm neurodiverse and I need this adjustment or I need that adjustment. But by having that open conversation with everybody, it's not singling out certain people. I know there's a colleague of ours who talks about chair envy, and at their organization, they have workplace adjustments. And someone with a back injury got an ergonomically designed chair, which was all, adjustable here, there, and everywhere. And everybody else in the office was saying, why can't I have a chair like that? They might not have needed a chair like that. But if you have an organization where everybody thinks, oh, it's great that they've got a chair they need. Actually, I don't need a chair. What I could really do with is a bit of flexible working on Fridays, or I could do with a pen that works differently, or I could do with, whatever it might be, so that actually there isn't that disabled people are getting all the goodies. It's about saying to everybody, actually, inclusion is about involving and including and engaging with everybody. So you might be someone with no protected characteristics as far as the law is concerned, but you're still important to the organisation. And people have different needs. So you might be, a white, straight, non-disabled bloke, but you still might have family responsibilities, or you might be doing an open university degree, or you might have a hobby, or there might be all sorts of reasons why you need different, ways of working. And so instead of just singling out certain groups of people, it should be about saying to everybody within the organization, what do we need to do for you to perform at your very best? And then it becomes the kind of place where people feel safe to say, oh, well, actually, I'm autistic. It would be really helpful if you did X, Y, Z.
100%. And I think as well, I think when you ask that question, how do we find out who's disabled? It reminds me of the game Guess Who. And like I was terrible at that game anyway because I'm registered blind. But for me, I'm like, you don't need to know. I love what you're saying there. About really just homing in, having that conversation. It can be anybody who needs that adjustment. I think about my sister there, her childcare. She needs to get out of the Friday to leave early. She has a type of adjustment in work that makes it accessible for her to do that. And she can come back and work in hours later. I look at some of my colleagues who maybe have to take extra breaks due to not even just disability, because maybe they are ADHD and they've maybe come up, like I'm sitting saying I'm ADHD myself, and I know a lot of times I come off meetings and I'm like, I need to decompress for 5 minutes and I just need to go stand in the backyard and let a million things fly into the air. So moving away from that belonging, then what about acceptance then? So how can we, as maybe a colleague or a senior leader, how can we begin to have those conversations where we are asking what support you need? Especially if maybe somebody has disclosed. Let's start with that. If somebody's disclosed, how do we have that conversation with them? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger is that people want to be the experts, and nobody is. There is nobody alive who knows about every single condition and what barriers people might face and what the solutions might be. So the best place to start is having that conversation with someone. Okay, thank you for telling me about that. Um, Assume I know nothing about that and tell me exactly what I need to do so that you can be supported here. You might want to give some examples. Are there things around the working hours that you do, or where you work, or is there any technology? Please tell me what we need to do, because we really want to make sure that your stay with us, as long as it might be, is absolutely as good as it possibly can be. So I think it's about not being frightened to be vulnerable and to be open about your own ignorance, and just say, please tell me what you need. Because the reality is that you might have employed 10 people with exactly the same diagnosis previously, but this person will need something completely different because they're a different person and they experience it in different ways. So the worst thing that you can do is kind of make an assumption and say, oh, you're blind. Okay, well, here's all of your information in Braille. Most blind people don't read
Yeah,
Braille.
only
And
10%.
so, yeah, so just because one person does doesn't mean, you don't then know that how everybody else does. So I think having that warm conversation, that it's clear that the intention is around, we want to make sure that your work with us is as good as it can be, that you're as comfortable as you can be, that we make this work for you. Tell us what we can do. And there may be some requests that you have to say no to, but at least you can have that open dialogue then about things like, it might be something very simple, like, can you not leave things in the walkway because I might trip up over them? Or it might be about flexible working, or it might be about BSL interpretation, or whatever it is. It makes it much easier to have that open conversation. And then if you're talking to someone who hasn't mentioned that they're disabled and you don't know whether they are or not, have the same conversation. We want you to thrive here. We want you to be as productive as you can. Tell us what we need to do so that you will feel comfortable here and be able to contribute. And then it's not singling out the disabled people, it's showing yourself as an inclusive employer.
I love that there because this is the thing I think about accessibility, and it's something we hear a lot. Is accessibility benefits everybody, so it does. There's always a benefit to everybody, and I think when I think about acceptance or even that sense of belonging as an individual and organization, I think that when you see that representation, when you don't have to feel the need to tell people you're disabled and you know that you're getting the support, it makes you happier, you're more productive, you tend to refer everybody because I know I've done a lot of AMS. I've referred half of my friends, half of my family, and it wasn't about the referral bonus because I wasn't even getting it working in TA. It was because I knew that this is a place that even if you weren't disabled or even if you were disabled, no matter who you are, there's a place for you and there's a path for you. And I found empowerment throughout there because I was led to lead my own kind of path rather than being told this is where you're fitting in because you're disabled. It's a bit like school, I feel sometimes. Looking at education, if we look at education in school, we have segregated education for a lot of kids who are disabled. I went to a mainstream primary school. I was in this, just inverted commas, special needs class, and it was a class of not even just children who had disability or who were divergent. It was but children who were naughty, children who were being bad as well. So it was almost that like I remember there was a child put in one day, and it was the kid who was fighting with the teacher like half an hour before. It was that was almost seen as a place to put children who you didn't want in your class.
Yeah,
Um,
problem children. Yeah.
Problem, that's it. And like I did not enjoy it, and I think we are moving away from it a little bit. I think in some ways and forms, but for me, with education, do you think there's a part there that plays into that acceptance and belonging of yourself as a person with disability? Do you think there's something that plays into that as you transition into adulthood?
Yeah, I mean, that's really, it's so important, isn't it? Because everything that we learn as children and experience as children will impact on our experiences as adults. And I think that, as you say, mainstream education is now more inclusive than it was. I think it still has a long way to go. Um, but, and it doesn't work for everybody, and there does need to be additional provision for some. But I think that, there is a general kind of impression that one way of teaching will work for every child. And that doesn't work even if you take disability out of the equation, but it certainly doesn't work if you put disability inside the equation. So my eldest daughter works in a base for children with autism, and she has 8 children in her class. And she has to produce 8 lesson plans because each child learns in a different way. And again, as we were saying before, you could have 5 children with exactly the same, they've got autism and dyslexia and dyspraxia, but they will all experience it differently. And so what will work for one won't work for another. So the challenge for education is, how do you meet all of those different diverse needs, which might be around disability or neurodiversity or something completely different, in ways which make sure that everybody feels like they belong. I mean, I was of the generation with the 11 plus, which was horrible. Horrible. So, you either went to the grammar school or you were a loser and you went to the secondary modern. I mean, it was just, how can you decide at 11, years old what somebody. And actually, within those two groups, there was going to be an enormous diversity of aspiration, what people want to do. Some people are very academic, others are very arty, others are good at drama, others are good at practical things like, the woodwork, I can remember, and metalwork at school.
Oh,
And so
hated
it's
that. Hated.
but it's about making sure that every child is able to discover what their strengths are, and they'll all be different. And then, not trying to mold every child to be the same as everybody else. So if someone is really good at music, but not great at maths, it doesn't matter if they don't get A-level maths. But what it does matter is that they're encouraged to do the music and learn how to, you know, compose or whatever it might be that they want to learn. And so that everybody feels that when they leave school, they have a place in the world. And we don't just need scientists or just mathematicians. We need all sorts of different people. And for me, education is about finding those strengths and those aspirations for each child and then enabling them to reach that without any judgment. Because as a society, we need the plumbers as much as we need the scientists. We need. I passed on the way back from an appointment this morning. A guy that was picking up the rubbish on the street, and I remember thinking, if hedge fund managers suddenly stopped working, nobody will be any the wiser. But if this guy suddenly stopped working, we'd all know it within a few days. And actually, it's about making sure that every child grows into an adult that realizes the contribution they make is valid, is valuable, is right for them, and that they have access to it.
I couldn't agree more. I think as well with education, I sometimes think of education and think that we were taught one certain way. Now I went to a school and I did get a little bit more support in that school. I'll be honest, it was amazing. But being the reluctant, moody teenager I wanted to be normal. And again, inverted commas, I wanted to be like my friends. I didn't want to have to travel for education to be in a class of six and have to drive back. It was quite an hour and a half each way. So it was, and I can remember sleeping in the taxi, sleeping in the taxi coming home, but coming home and telling my friends that I went to boarding school, but it wasn't boarding school because I was embarrassed. I had special needs, more inverted commas. But the biggest lesson I learned from that is I dropped off the face of the earth when I left that to go into do my levels, because in mainstream education you were told to think and learn a certain way. But now when you go into the workplace, one of the things they teach you in workplaces and icebreakers is we all think and work differently. And I think, why aren't we teaching that in education? It baffles me, and I know that our a podcast sponsor, Diverse Educators, they almost work with the ERGs, employee resource groups, to kind of help drive that message that each child is individual and that there's no one size fits all. And I think that brings us on to ERGs, Jane. Within we talk about businesses and how we are trying to get them to be more inclusive, more accessible. What is your views on employee resource groups?
Oh, I think they can be absolutely invaluable because it's that lived experience voice again that we talked about earlier on. And you were just saying about everybody thinks differently. I mean, thank goodness everybody thinks differently, because wouldn't it be a dreadful world if we all felt, thought the same way and came up with the same conclusions? One of the things I love, one of the many things I love about Evenbreak is that, we have people in Evenbreak who think differently from me. I mean, I'm neurotypical, so I've got your bog standard boring brain. And there are other people in Evenbreak who will come up with ideas that originally you think, no, that's just ridiculous. And then you think about it a bit longer and you think, no, it isn't, it's genius. And it's something I would never have come up with in a million years. And actually, for every organization, I mean, what we say is that actually employing neurodiverse people isn't just a luxury, it's a business imperative. If you want to be at the head of the game, if you want to challenge the status quo, thinking of new innovative ideas, you need people who think differently. And I think having employee resource groups within companies can be such a great resource for the organization. And often people think, oh, it's nice for the disabled people to have support. And yeah, okay, of course, it's nice to have a tribe. It's nice to have people that you don't have to explain everything to. But actually, that's not the only value of an ERG. It's also about giving that group of people, in this case, disabled people, a voice so that they can say, do you know what would be really good in this organization if we did this instead of that? Or if we added this? Or I wonder if they thought of doing something else. And actually, that's incalculable in terms of the value to an organization, especially in terms of success breeding success. So the more disabled people we employ, the better the feedback we get about how accessible or inclusive we are, the more we can improve on that, the more we can get more diverse people. It's kind of a real upward virtuous circle, really. And so I think having employee resource groups that are resourced properly, so they're funded, and also that the whole of the organization understands why they exist. Because I can remember there were times in organizations where I've worked previously where there's been a kind of pressure on someone who's going to, I don't know, the black workers group. Well, we've got to do your work while you're off swanning it off to your group. And there's a kind of negative connotation. And so people think, well, I better not go to that group because I'm going to be badly thought of. So if we're going to have ERGs, we need to be making sure that everybody, particularly line managers, understand the value of those groups, not just to the individuals, but to the organization as a whole, so that it's seen as a positive thing, not as a threat. I think there used to be a kind of, what are those black people You know, what secrets are they all sharing and what are they drumming up together? And of course, it isn't anything to do with that. And it's the same with disability groups or women's groups or carers groups or, whatever group it might be we're talking about.
100%. I can remember there was an LGBT group. There was no employee resource group in any company I worked with prior to AMS set up or that I was aware of. But there was one organisation, a call centre, and they had the LGBT. I think it was just LGBT. The back actually, it had just been LGB back then, and they had this group set up. And I can remember being in the canteen and somebody saying, "Oh, what does that group do?" And somebody said, "Oh, there's that gay agenda thing." And I can remember thinking, "Oh, this is what the gay agenda is." I've always wanted to know because we hear so much. It's groups sitting talking about how to benefit the organisation and create representation. And for me, like with the ERGs, I wouldn't have known I was neurodivergent without being a member of the neurodiversity ERG at AMS. I'm going to say that completely wrong there. And for me, like that, I didn't know what ADHD was before. To me, it was just this completely offset thing. Nope, can't impact me. I'm disabled. That's all I can be, kind of thing. And that was just because I was struggling with my identity. But when I started to open up and listen to other people's stories, started to look at some of the training that we would get delivered from different organizations, I stopped and went, "Oh my goodness, they're talking about me the whole way through this." And then the more you kind of start to scratch, it's like a scratch card. And when you get a winning scratch card, you get more excited as you go along. That was like me realizing I wasn't even that I was excited. It was just like more like, "Oh, I need to know more. I need to know more." And then I completely went away and had conversations with people with lived experience. It's like, "Do you think I have ADHD?" And I told them a little bit. And they're like, "I knew you had it as soon as you come on the call." I told my mum, and I told my mum. My mum was like, "I just thought you were a wee bit quirky because you were gay and you're disabled." Just like, "And you're really artsy, I just thought you were a wee bit quirky." And I was just like, "But now you've said it, it makes sense." And I'm like, why did nobody stop at any point to think he's ADHD? But for me, that's the empowerment of what an employee resource group can do. It can it's more than just 9 to 5 work. It's something that empowers you in your whole personal life. Um, but in terms of our next topic, I'm going to talk about a topic which I think most businesses do struggle with, and that's policies and processes around disability. Do we write disability specific processes for adjustments? Should we take away the disability and write specifically, as we discussed earlier, for everybody? What would be your advice around policies and setting up processes?
I would say a bit of both. I think when we're writing sort of mainstream policies which apply to everybody, so that might be annual leave policies, it might be sickness absence, it might be I can't say it, grievance policies, that we need to make sure that when we're writing those policies, we're also thinking about disability while we're writing it. So with annual leave policies, for example, at Evenbreak, we also have disability leave. So, for example, if we had a member of the team recently had his prosthetic leg broke, so he needed to go and have it fixed. And he said, "Oh, I'll take a day's annual leave." "No, you won't." "Well, I'll take a day sick." "No, you won't. You're not ill." That was a specific disability issue. So just take that day, do what you need to do, and that's it. And so when we're thinking about leave, we need to think about different people and what different kinds of leave they might need. So I think it's about making sure that disability inclusion is included in every policy that we write, however mainstream it is. But then there will be specific ones. So it might be, for example, an access to work policy. So if you've got people who are um, needing access, assistive technology or some kind of support that's going to cost money that we're going to access to work for, there needs to be a policy around that. So making sure it happens in a timely way, making sure that it's budgeted for centrally so that individual line managers don't feel resentful that they're losing budget because they've got a disabled member on their team. So I think, it's important to have both. And again, going back to representation and the kind of nothing about us without us, the best way to make sure that we get that representation and that inclusion is to make sure that disabled people have a voice in writing those policies. So it may be that one of the things we do with an ERG is say, we're changing our policy on whatever it might be. Can you have a look over this and make sure that it works for you as well? And then it's about how we promote those policies. So how do we educate people about where they are, how to read them, make sure that they're implemented properly, because having policies is one thing, but they also need to be implemented consistently. So there's all that goes alongside just the writing of policies. But yeah, I mean, disability inclusion needs to be included everywhere that's mainstream, but also it might need a couple of additional things on its own as well.
And accessible. I think that's one thing I noticed with policies is they tend to make them sometimes and they're not accessible, and you're like, the people who need to read these policies can't read them because they're not accessible. And I really agree though with the ERGs. Like the ERGs, I tell everybody, an ERG is like it's an untapped resource if your business, if you're creating products, if you're creating designing, whatever it is you're doing, training, whatever it is, speak to your ERGs because that's essentially what they're there to do. They're there to help your business with with disability, with being more inclusive, and helping identify the things that you won't because you don't have that lived experience. And like I know that's something at AMS that we do really incredibly well. I think for myself, I've been very fortunate with my career at AMS. I've went through recruitment. I've now been our disability. I'll try to say that again. Our global disability ERG lead, and in that time, I'm now a disability inclusion coordinator, and that's all came from that role and from being able to contribute. And I think that's where I think AMS's disability we do really well is we're contributing to the business. We're a resource and a valuable resource, and we have leadership buying in. We have a C-suite director who is our exco sponsor, and for me, I'm like to have that support, that voice in the boardroom when. Like as I said, I'm a small fish in the pond. There's times I go in front of a boardroom, my ADHD kicks in, and I tell them what I had for dinner 3 weeks ago, rather than answer the question we're talking about. So again, that on top resource. Jane, I'm conscious that we are coming into our last kind of 10 minutes in the podcast, and I want to talk about how organizations can utilize, sign up, or become a member for Evenbreak because you are going through so much exciting change at the moment. You have incredible candidates, incredible partners already. How can any of our listener organizations reach out to you and what can they expect?
Yeah, no, that I'd be very happy to have a conversation with anybody who's listening to this. So I'm Jane Hatton. So you can find me on LinkedIn, or if you Google me, I should be fairly easily available. But Evenbreak is the name, Google Evenbreak, and again, you'll find us. And what we can do is we can have a chat with you about how to attract disabled candidates. One of the things that our candidates say to us is we don't know which employers are receptive to our applications. We know that we're often rejected for no reason other than that we're disabled, but it's difficult to know outside, which organisations are like AMS, genuine about being disability inclusive. And what the candidates say is if we can see that an employer pays to advertise their roles on a job board that's just for disabled people, that's a real strong commitment. It's a strong demonstration of their commitment. So yes, you can say we are an equal opportunities employer. No one really believes that. So if you are doing something positive, putting your money where your mouth is, paying to advertise your jobs on a job board that's just for disabled people, what you will do is you won't be inundated with disabled candidates because it's a smaller audience. But what we find is that disabled candidates tend to be really good, too good actually, at self-selecting. So although you won't get hundreds of candidates, the candidates that you do get will be really suitable for the job. And also, if there's an organisation that's worried about, not sure whether our recruitment process is as accessible as it should be, or are our adverts written in an inclusive way? Is there any way we can make them more inclusive? Or what about our hiring managers? Do they understand the benefits of disability? Because, as you were just saying, employing disabled people is nothing to do with pity or charity. It's a really, grounded, evidenced business case. And so if organisations listening to this really want to find out more about how they can tap into all of those business benefits, then I'd be very, very happy to have a chat with them. So it's Jane H at evenbreak.co.uk, or if you just Google Evenbreak or Jane Hatton, you'll find us.
And we will have your details with Evenbreak on our website as well, so everyone can reach out to you. Jane, you were talking there, and one of the things that kind of came into my mind is, with kind of becoming that inclusive employer, writing those job descriptions accessibly, with disability confidence, if an organisation is trying to maybe offer an interview or trying to go that journey of disability confidence, is that something that you can maybe advise them on becoming as well?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I have some doubts about disability confident as a scheme. It's not perfect, but I do think it's worth doing because it has a framework which is useful to follow. There are 3 levels, as you know. So one level is we're committed. The second level is we're actually putting things into practice now. But those 2 levels are self-assessed. And then there's a third level called leader, which is then externally assessed. And I think it's worth doing, partly because there's a lot of good practice attached to it, which is useful for the organisation. But also, I think if we're trying to attract disabled candidates, although they may not have lots of faith in the scheme itself, just the fact that the organisation is looking at disability confident scheme is an indication that disability is on their agenda. And so people are more likely to apply. And I think, DWP who run it are aware that it has limitations. And, I think they're working on trying to make it better, which would be great. So I think if you don't think it's going to be the panacea, which it isn't, it's probably a good thing to do because you'll learn good practice from it. You'll be able to offer things like guaranteed interviews for disabled candidates who meet the criteria. And it just demonstrates that as an organisation, this is something that you're including in your diversity agenda. And not everybody is. So it gives you an advantage above those.
I think today we have given so like, yourself as you have given so much valuable information. I'm thinking like if you have an organization now, my notepad would probably be filled. And I'd probably have more questions I'd want to reach out to. Jane, I am so blown away that you've been our first guest on the Inclusivity. You have, as usual, you're my idol. As you know, I think that your work is absolutely fabulous. But every time we speak, it leaves me feeling more passionate. Like, how do I bring these newfound kind of lessons or this extra lessons to AMS and beyond? And I think that reach out if you're listening to this and get in touch with Evenbreak. You have a candidate talent pool there of people who are getting development themselves because you're supporting candidates. It's not just that you're picking them up, just offline or off the street. You're working with the candidates and really helping them to build that confidence and build that, I'm trying to think of the word, that kind of how you find an inclusive employer, I think is the bottom line of it. But before we move on and kind of say goodbyes, we do a moment on the podcast, what is called Spill the Tea moment. So Spill the Tea is, it doesn't sound, we're not going to slag anybody off, we're not going to say anything bad about anybody, but what we're going to do is think about a moment recently or even in your career, Jane, a moment that has been your career that has really defined a moment where you've helped somebody overcome an obstacle or even yourself, an obstacle that has been inaccessible. So spill the tea, chasing the camera again, spill the tea on a moment that's been inaccessible for you.
Wow, you didn't prepare me for this. I think one of the things that you battle on, we all do, don't we? And we're trying to think we're making the world a better place. And there are times when you think, I'm banging my head against this brick wall and nothing changes and it takes so long to change. And, new government comes in and we seem to be going backwards. And sometimes it can all feel very depressing and very, is it even worth me trying? Because everything I do falls on deaf ears and it doesn't seem to make a difference. And then there are moments when something happens and you think, no, actually, yeah, but things are changing. So it might be, so I'm going to cheat and use a number of moments here, but it might be a candidate who says, one yesterday I was talking to on an event that we were doing, and she had got almost fed up of looking for a job. And every time the employer found out that she was disabled, it was, oh, sorry, you can't do that job. And she was getting to the point where she was thinking, I may as well even give up applying for jobs because it's never going to happen. And that's a really depressing thing to think, when you're any age, and she was quite young. And she's not on her own, of course. Lots of disabled people feel that. I get rejected so often, there's no point. But she looked on Evenbreak. She found a job with one of our employers. She's been promoted a number of times since. And even more importantly, she's making a lot of changes in that organisation as a result of her experience and saying, we could do this better, we could do this differently. And so I kind of think, that's just one person whose life we changed because she was able to get a job that really used all of her skills. But also she is that ripple effect, isn't it? So she is challenging people's thoughts in her organisation now, changing practice so it becomes more inclusive and accessible. And you think, that's only one person. What about all of the other people who've got jobs through Evenbreak? I think that's something that every time that happens, it reaffirms that's why we're doing what we're doing. And then another funny thing that happens occasionally is that somebody will say, "Are you the Jane Hatton that wrote that book?" I've read that book. It's on my shelf. And you think, wow, I thought it was only my kids that read my book,
I've read your book. Should we tell everybody before we finish off about your book? Because I feel that that in itself is a resource, an encyclopedia that every organization leader should read.
Well, it can be a good starting point. So actually, I wrote two, and you'll tell by the titles they're not academic tomes. They're certainly not heavy reading. It's very conversational. The first one is called "A Dozen Brilliant Reasons to Employ Disabled People," and it's all that about what are the business reasons. It's got nothing to do with CSR or pity or charity. It's about what does a business gain by employing disabled people. So if you're not sure, that's quite a good starting point. Or if you are sure, but you've got to somehow make that business case to your own organisation, that can be quite a good starting point. And then the other one I wrote was called, you can see there's a theme here, "A Dozen Great Ways to Recruit Disabled People." And that really goes through the recruitment process, right from, vacancy arising to somebody being onboarded and everything in between, and what the barriers might be for disabled candidates. And as we said earlier on in this session, if you get things right for disabled people, actually you get them right for everybody else as well. So if you make it more inclusive, if you make your recruitment process more inclusive for disabled people, you're actually going to make it more inclusive for people who are introverts or people from an ethnic minority group or people from a different socio-economic group or whatever it might be. And so that's quite, again, it's an easy read, but I suggest people use it as a bit of a benchmark and actually think, am I doing this already? Oh, yeah, we do that really well already. That's lucky. But, oh, maybe we could do a bit more on this bit. And it's just a kind of bit of a checklist to say, what are we doing that's working? What could we do differently? And some of them are really quick wins that don't cost anything. So, yeah, a couple of books. They're on Amazon if anybody's interested.
And I gotta be honest, when I came into my role as the RG lead, you'd sent them across to me when I kind of knew my role. It really set me up, so it did, because I was able to go into boardrooms and be able to kind of say, well, this is actually why we should do this. And it was almost like, oh, wait a second, he knows what he's talking about. He's went from being the person shouting to the person coming out with solutions. And it was because of work like yours, Jane. I was like, again, I've been blown away by this whole episode. I want to ask before we go, because we just talked about your books, is there going to be one in the future? Is there going to be another dozen brilliant ideas out there coming?
Yeah, so the next one I'd like to do is about what happens after recruitment. So actually the organisation itself, making the organisation so that people don't just get the job there, but they then thrive and progress and contribute and they're retained and all of that stuff. I haven't thought of a snappy title, but it will be a dozen somethings about something or other, won't it? So I'm going on a trip very shortly, and I might use my hours on the plane to think about book number 3, maybe. But don't hold your breath is all I can say.
I can't hold my breath for long, and I will message you every day if I know there's a book coming back. Is it here yet? So I will not hold my breath. I will wait until you let me know what's coming out. And again, we'll put the links for your books on the website as well. But this has been an amazing opening episode for the Inclusivi-T. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today.
I feel very privileged to be on your first episode. Thank you very much. I'm very honoured.
First on my list, so straight away, I get my icon, my idol on. How to get you. But I am going to do a little toast. Jane, Evenbreak, thank you so much for spilling the tea on the Inclusivi-T. I'm hoping our people on the video can see this mug. It's a branded mug, I swear. I think. Hopefully it's the right one. But listen, I will put everything online. Jane, thank you so much to our listeners. I can't wait to share this podcast with you. And do check out the transcript online and video on YouTube or across all our major channels. Bye!